In October 1972, in the Omani desert, the last wild herd of Arabian oryx was hunted down. Some were killed, some were carted off alive. When it was over, there were none left in the wild, not in Oman, and not anywhere else on Earth. What almost nobody watching that year expected was that this would not be the end of the species. Because a decade earlier, a handful of them had already been taken somewhere else entirely. The Arabian oryx is a small, pale antelope, built for a place almost nothing else can live. It goes for long stretches without drinking, pulling what water it needs from the plants it eats. And it walks enormous distances across open sand to find them. It had lived across the Arabian Peninsula for as long as anyone had kept records, and for far longer than that. For most of human history, there were enough of them that they turned up in travelers' tales. The pale, horned desert animal some people believe became the unicorn. What the oryx could not survive was not the desert. It was the rifle and the motor car. Through the 20th century, hunting parties with modern firearms and vehicles could cross the sand faster than the animals could scatter, chase down a herd that had no defense against an engine, and leave. It did not take centuries. Within a single human lifetime, an animal that had ranged across an entire peninsula was pushed back into a few remote corners of it. Anyone paying attention could see where the line was heading and where it would end. Which brings us back to 1972. That last herd, around 6 animals, was found on a stony desert plain in central Oman called the Jiddat al-Harasis. Poachers reached it first. Some of the oryx were killed where they stood. The last few were captured alive and taken away. With them gone, the Arabian oryx entered a category that sounds like a contradiction: extinct in the wild. Not extinct. There were still oryx alive, but there were none left living wild in nature, anywhere. A species that now existed only because people were keeping it alive in captivity. And this is the part of the story that had quietly begun 10 years before the last wild herd was lost. In 1962, a conservation group then called the Fauna Preservation Society looked at those same falling numbers and decided not to wait for the end. They sent an expedition into the desert, to a place called Wadi Matan, and captured a small number of wild oryx, the seed of a safeguard population, in case the wild one didn't make it. Those animals, together with a few gathered from private collections, were sent to an unlikely place to save an Arabian desert species, the Phoenix Zoo in Arizona, with support from the World Wildlife Fund. They called it the World Herd. It was an odd, fragile kind of insurance. A species that had ruled the Arabian sand for millennia was now a managed herd behind fences on another continent, its entire future resting on a few founding animals and whether they would breed. But it was something. So when the last wild herd was wiped out in 1972, the species was not actually gone. It was in Arizona, half a world from the desert it belonged to, being bred back, slowly, with no guarantee it would ever go home. Getting it home took another decade. In 1980, the Sultan of Oman, Qaboos, issued a decree to protect the oryx and handed the job of watching over them to the Harasis, the desert people of the very region where the last wild herd had been destroyed. The people who lived where the species ended were asked to guard its return. Then, on the 31st of January, 1982, captive-bred oryx, descendants of that Arizona herd, were released back into the Omani desert. The exact number is uncertain. Sources put it somewhere around 10 to 13 animals. More releases followed, at Yaluni 2 years later, and over time the effort spread beyond Oman, to Saudi Arabia, to Jordan, to Israel, to the United Arab Emirates. Country by country, the oryx was put back into the wild it had been erased from. It's worth being clear about who the effort was, because it was not one person, and it was not one zoo. It was conservation groups and a zoo in Arizona and Gulf governments and desert communities working across 3 decades. No single hero, just a lot of people in a lot of places, refusing to let the number stay at 0. And here, the story stops being simple, because the same effort that brought the oryx back also shows how fragile back really is. In Oman, the animals had been returned to a protected area that, in 1994, became a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognition of one of the great conservation recoveries. But there was oil under that desert, and in 2007, the Omani government cut the protected area by about 90%. UNESCO's response had never happened before. It removed the site from the World Heritage List entirely, the first place ever struck off. And inside that shrinking sanctuary, the oryx herd had already collapsed, from around 450 animals in the 1990s to roughly 65, with only a few breeding pairs left. In that one place, the recovery had been allowed to come undone. It was a quiet, important lesson. A recovery is not a finish line. It can be reversed by the same people who managed it in a single decision, whenever the land is worth more for something else. And yet, taken as a whole, across all those countries, the oryx kept climbing. In 2011, the International Union for Conservation of Nature moved it off the extinct in the wild list and reclassified it as vulnerable, one of the very few animals ever to make that journey, from gone in the wild back to merely at risk. Today, by the most recent counts, something over 1,000 Arabian oryx live wild again, with several thousand more in captivity, though those figures are a few years old, and conservationists hold them carefully, because the wild population is still small and still watched. Which is the honest place to end. The Arabian oryx is back in the desert it was erased from. But back doesn't mean safe. It means fences and feeding and guards, and a sanctuary its own government cut apart for oil. Nobody undid extinction. You can't. What people managed to do was hold it off. To take an animal that had been wiped out of the wild, put it back, and then keep putting it back, for as long as anyone keeps paying attention. That's the part worth keeping. Not that the oryx was saved, but that, gone from the wild, turned out, this once, not to be the end. As long as someone keeps holding.